We can do it all. Yeah. So
That's
tell me,
right.
so you were saying that we were just talking about, we both had Easter dinner. You're, of course, in Canada. I'm in Sedona. And you had a hangover from your food, as like I did, and you were explaining this. If you'd touch on that again.
Sure. Well, I usually have just for dessert, I usually have a dark chocolate. I have, 90% cocoa. And I decided to indulge in some carrot cake. And by gosh, the next day I was very sluggish. It was very hard. I didn't feel uh, unwell, but I didn't feel well. So that there's a definite difference when one starts fine tuning one's system, whether it's through food or exercise,
Or
good sleep.
quarantine.
Yeah, any of these things. There's a difference. There's a definite difference that you feel, and you feel it more acutely as you're fine tuning. I think you start to feel more acutely when there is an imbalance. In other words, perhaps a rich food or less sleep or inactivity when you've been very used to activity. So it's amazing how your body starts to respond to you when you are conditioning it in a certain way.
So it's curious that this quote unquote pandemic is causing us all to pay more attention. We're settling down a little bit. We're moving out of our, if you will, our mindless patterns and habits that we've all been running on almost as fast as you can go. In fact, we've been doing it indefinitely. All of a sudden, there's this huge slowdown, and all of a sudden, we're noticing differences because we've moved out of this rapid speed of mindless moving forward that's going on. We're starting to notice things.
Yeah, and there's been some speculation, and we can take this into the ether
I hope we
if you
do.
want. Yeah, is there's been speculation the fact that the coronavirus is actually nature's way, and we can define nature as being anything one wants it to be,
Sure.
whether nature is innate, whether nature is an essence, whether innate is a spiritual source. Put in whatever definition you want or whatever name you want there, that it has been specifically timed at this moment in human history in order to wake us up, human beings up. What do you think of that, Jim?
I've started making notes when we're doing our talks now, so I can put them in the Google descriptions. And
Yeah.
what I translated what you said is coronavirus is nature's rotorooter.
Oh my goodness, that's pretty dramatic.
But what you're saying is right, because what I've been saying is that coronavirus is just another symptom of a sick planet. In other words, we've ignored the fires. We ignored the fires in California. We haven't taken any of that really seriously. Okay, we think about not maybe living in the woods so much, but Australia, all of Australia was on fire last year. We've
Hmm.
had typhoons. We've had all kinds of global problems that suggest that things are not well, and we've ignored it. I mean, this climate change thing is very interesting. I've been reading some articles, and it's conclusive that the amount of carbon in the air and burning fossil fuels, which, by the way, forests and trees and all of that stuff that eventually becomes petroleum started out as trees, which attract, and they trap carbon. And now that we're burning it, we're releasing it all back into the atmosphere. And we have an absolute ignorance of the world that we live in and around us. And now that distortion is starting to hit us as a species directly.
Hmm.
And so, in other words, we have the dissonance on the planet is growing, and the wake up calls so far have not been significant. We've ignored global climate change, we've ignored it. That's mostly because we can't imagine how to solve it. But so we ignore it. And it's getting too big now.
Yeah. Although, again, with the climate change, again, through some studies and research that I've read, climate change in terms of the Earth going through cyclical periods of temperature change is very natural. And in fact, the idea that there is climate change, that exists in us in a natural cycle that the Earth experiences. What, however, is disarming is the fact that we humans have precipitated the cycle and, in fact, have over harmed, if you like, whatever is the Earth's timing, whatever is the Earth's balance, so that there will always be climate change. So I wanted to put that into context, that that's not climate change per se that is the real problem, but what humans are doing to precipitate climate change to the point of an extreme in our own lifetimes. That's where we know, or we realize that if we're not careful as human beings, we're driving the Earth to an outcome that is catastrophic for us.
A big hiccup.
Yeah.
A big hiccup.
So maybe coronavirus is sort of like, okay, we're going to up the ante here and find out if the human race, because what is amazing about this coronavirus is it's global. It is the first, if you like, disaster or extreme occurrence that is happening globally. You mentioned Australian fires, you mentioned the fires in California, there's flooding in various other areas of the world, but we could certainly, some of us could have sat back and said, well, it's not happening close enough, or it's not happening on my continent. Therefore, I don't have to be that concerned. I can, be commiserate and send some money and that kind of thing, but I don't really have to get engaged. And yet this coronavirus now suddenly has roped us all in. There is no human being on this planet that is not affected.
I find Wired magazine to be an extraordinary insight into what's going on in so very many things. And I'm reading an article right now. In fact, there's two parts to it. I think it's the April issue. They talk about we actually have the science to deal with climate change, or the errors that we've placed in our atmosphere and in our waters and this and that. And but the point I want to make is they're talking about old growth forests and how very much carbon. I don't know the words. I don't use the word amalgamate, but they sequestrate. I think that's the word. I mostly see it in print. I don't say it and I don't hear it, so I don't know the pronunciation. But they absorb carbon, and these old growth forests have a massive capacity. In fact, it's far beyond anything that we could produce to sequester carbon. And in the last 100 years, we've leveled a massive amount of the natural forest on this planet, not to mention what's going on in the Amazon to this day. And everybody knows that the trees are the lungs of the planet because they take in carbon dioxide, which is to say, and they release oxygen. And as we wipe out the forests, this carbon problem becomes immense. And we do our own. You look at in Washington, New York City, the skyscrapers, when they were building skyscrapers, as they called them in the 40s and the 30s and the 20s, and these guys are up on these beams of iron, and the pollution in the background is far more than what it is now. It's just that the pollution continues to rise and rise and rise, but it's not like it's all of a sudden since we got cars. We've been polluting as long as we've been burning wood. And as we become bigger as a population, the amount of soot and carbon we put in the atmosphere has grown immensely. And the trees aren't keeping up with it anymore. And by the way, we cut them all down. Most of them, lots of them.
It's coincidental. Well, it's not. It's synchronistic. I was just watching a documentary about, I believe her name is Diane Beresford, and she's a botanist. And UK, but transplanted to North America. And she was talking about the glory of trees, speaking about their systems, first of all, that the trees have in terms of their root systems, the fact that there are parent trees. And this, just to give you an example and to sort of amplify what you're saying, Jim. She talks about parent trees, in other words, the mother trees, the oldest trees, which then are the tallest and the biggest. And guess what? Those parent trees are the ones that generally have been cut down first. And once they're cut down, because they, in their own way, are like parents, they sustain and nurture and actually feed the ecosystem all around themselves. So that if they're chopped down, that tree space forest, even if there are trees left that are, if you like, the teenagers of the so-called system, that forest will never have the same nutrient resiliency or ability to produce the capacity for that kind of abundance ever again. The other aspect that I've learned, and I didn't realize this was how important this was, any of the tree line that is found along a water or shore, there is such a connection between the water and the trees. Again, something that I didn't know, that when the trees are cut down, the water and the shoreline in their own way starts to erode. It doesn't have the mineral intake, and again, the sustenance intake that the trees provided in the past. And so, for instance, they gave, there was an example of Japan where there was a deforestation effort made along one peninsula, thinking, well, let's settle a city there or a settlement there. Can't remember the name, but in any case, so they deforested the entire lot of trees along that entire shoreline, and that whole area has become a desert. It is incapable of any kind of growth, when in fact at one time it had lush forestation. And so not only are we cutting trees down, but we are also, by that act, harming very much so the water, the bodies of water that surround and are along the tree line.
Yeah, it's criminal's not a good word because ignorance is a better word, naivete is a better word, but at the same time, we're coming to a point, it's called cause and effect, where we learn about this or we don't. I wrote an article, it's been 2 or 3 years now, I wish I could grab it really readily, but there was a link at the bottom of this article about how trees communicate among and between themselves through the root system, and the root system really makes a forest, if you will, one living organism, all tied together by not only the root system, but all of the fungi and all the different kinds of bacteria and psyllium and all these different kinds of things. In fact, there's just as much forest going on under the ground within the arena of this root structure as there is above. And we have, it almost reminds me of Avatar with them, with their worship or their appreciation for that grand giant tree, like a grandfather, like you call it a mother. And we haven't achieved that yet. We think everything is for us, and if we don't mind our manners, we may not be here to enjoy. Or what occurs to me is we may end up with a problem, and we may have a much smaller population starting over again, a little wiser. And of course, I hope that's not the case, but we're at a point where the dissonance on the planet is becoming extreme, and what is otherwise poverty or some of the other afflictions of man that found within mankind. I mean, homelessness, a fake medicine system, a pharmaceutical-based medicine system, all of these things are adding up. And now this disease isn't something you watch on TV. We've all got it now. And we're all going to have to learn how to make new decisions soon.
Yeah. I wanted to just take one more point regarding the forest. Some of you may have heard of the term forest bathing. And I just wanted to mention that, and also to let those people know that Japan certainly has made great strides since that deforestation. They are very aware of how important forests and tree life is. In this case, they have regular sort of forays into the forest, and they call these kind of walks forest bathing, because again, I didn't know forests emit aromas, and those aromas are actually like medicine cabinets full of things like dopamine and menium and various other components that actually are good for us. And when we take in the aromas of the forest, walking through it, when we get home or when we leave, we feel better. And that is a scientific fact, because we are actually being like treated with dopamine or with other beneficial bacteria that actually does us good. And added to that, Jim, we might get on this. The allusion to, or the reference you made to pharmaceuticals, we know, and we are discovering further, that the human body is its own natural pharmaceutical factory. We produce everything that we need to self-heal. I wanted to maybe speak a little bit more about that, because that, again, is a natural base that perhaps a lot of us never knew that we actually had this amazing potential that we're just really uncovering in the last decade or so.
Alexis and I talk about driving to or being in Oregon next summer. And I want to drive, and she's up to the idea of that a little bit, and maybe getting an RV and doing it that way. And then she says, well, why don't we just drive around Oregon? Well, the reason we want to drive from Arizona to Oregon is because we have an opportunity to go through so many different redwood forests, because I've been doing it for years. I've been going back and forth for years. And what's so special about these forests is that, first off, of course, they're 100% natural. And when you go into these forests, redwoods in particular, and they are grand. Have you been in a redwood forest?
Yes, I've on the West Coast, Vancouver side, that area, but nothing as I've heard that Oregon is absolutely magnificent.
Yeah, Northern California, far Northern California and Oregon. And of course, most of that stuff was all clear cut. As humans made bigger and bigger saws, they could cut down bigger and bigger trees. That's what it boiled down to. But my point is you will find a cathedral when you go into a forest. It is so natural. The frequency of God is so eminent. It is so invasive. It is so there. And so part of this being inside this cathedral, I've not heard about the idea of aromas other than the idea that all trees have a smell. All the different barks from different trees have different kind of a smell. And I've explored that just a little bit, the different pines. But there's a world that the humans have lost sight of in our mad dash for more plastic stuff or more who knows what. And I dearly hope with this shutdown, this quarantine, I don't like the term lockdown. Lockdown is a very poor term. But this quarantine, self-quarantine, that we have all slowed down. That, Alexis and I had a very nice dinner Sunday. It was it was packaged well. And this is, you know, Lisa Dahl has 5 restaurants in Sedona, and it was there were napkins, and the bands around the napkins, and the silverware was plastic, but it was silver looking, and it's not expected that you're going to use plastic silverware, but she includes it. It was all very gallant and very elaborately. It was very thoughtfully done. But the next morning we were sick. Too much an overload, too much cream, too much this, too much that, too much whatever. And we haven't been eating like that lately. We eat like kings around the house here, but we eat simpler. And going back to the restaurant, which was overkill, and of course it was Easter, so it was fun, and we enjoyed it, but it was what you would call too much. And maybe we're going to learn about too much at some point, at some soon point here.
Mm-hmm.
So let's touch on it. So you want to touch on the idea of the pharmacopoeia of the human body, but I want to touch on something and hopefully see if we can tie them together. First off, I think that this is going to become a horrendous problem, shutting down the world. The damage that's done to the economy, and maybe this is the whole point. Maybe this is what needs to happen, is a restart. But my point is I'm not convinced that coronavirus is what we think it is, and I'm not convinced at all that we're treating it the right way. In fact, there's a doctor. Let's see if I can come up with his name really quick. Let's see. Say his last name is Slidell. Let's see here. He's a New York City ICU, I guess that's intensive care unit doctor. And his Dr. Kyle Seidel, he's a young guy, and he's validated as being, of course, a real doctor. But what he says he's in the Bronx. And what he says is that they're treating coronavirus like a pneumonia, because the advanced stages, basically what happens is the lungs start bleeding's not the right word, but releasing a lot of lymph, because the virus gets in the lungs and the villi or whatever they are in there. They become infected, and you have all this lymph in the lungs. And that's what pneumonia actually is. It's massive. You drown in your lungs because of lymph, because of damage to the components of the lungs and the breathing. But what he says, and he's trying to alert other doctors, and there is other doctors and other researchers starting to discover this for themselves. But when they work on these people that they're trying to save, they're discovering that what actually goes on in the lungs isn't a lack of oxygen. Let's see, I don't know if I can say this right. It's not a pneumonia type problem. It's like a high altitude sickness type problem, where it's like they suddenly were dropped off at 30,000 feet and they can't breathe because they can't absorb oxygen. But they're treating them with respirators and forcing oxygen into the system, and they're suggesting that the respirators are actually causing a lot of the problems. And I listen to a doctor in Brazil a lot. He's the one how I found out about this. They're using a mixture of oxygen and hydrogen. I think it's 2/3 hydrogen and 1/3 oxygen, or vice versa. And it's immediately clearing up the problem. This was in China. They played with hydrogen and oxygen because they use them in emergency rooms, and they're starting to see all over that hydrogen oxygen, rather than the standard respirators, is helping. And my point is ultimately that the doctors may become the solution to monitoring and managing this coronavirus, because what they've done right now is the government or the world has, or the spokespeople have cordoned off the whole world, and that needs to stop. People need to come back out, and I think they say only 6% have acute or really serious consequences of getting this virus. Only 6%. And what they need to do is put their attention to the people that get really sick, because most people don't. And see, nobody knows that. Most people don't get, everybody thinks you go outside, you're going to get coronavirus on your hands and you're going to put it on your face and then you're dead. And it's this massive, it's like a hysteria. And I'm hoping that this doctor and his work becomes really, because the doctors are fighting. I mean, they're trying to solve the problem, but they're looking for solutions. And I got a feeling that the doctors of the world are going to discover that this coronavirus isn't what it looks like. And in fact, it's something they've never seen, this high altitude sickness coming from a virus. And they don't understand that. But what I'd like to think is that we can solve this problem by the front edge of these doctors discovering that this pulmonary problem or this lung problem isn't what they think. They're going to start treating it right. They're going to discover that most people don't have to be quarantined. Just take the people that are really sick, and now they know how to treat them, and put this, we can start putting the world back together. I don't want to go back to the way we were, but in other words, what I'm saying is just some humans are starting to get a handle on the problem. It's different than what was assumed that it was. And as they start to get a real handle on the problem, then we can start to let people back out to stop this. I'm opposed to this extreme quarantine, because there's no end in sight on it, other than a vaccine, a hurried vaccine. And I don't want to have anything to do with anything like that. So any other kind of a solution is far more interesting to me.
Yeah, well, just to echo your remarks, we had a capacity of almost an overflow of ventilators, which is, I think, what you're referring to as a respirator. They're not being used because they realized the ventilators were actually harming the patient instead of making them better. They realized the ventilator is only used in very extreme cases, or in cases where there are other complications. In Canada, for instance, the majority of people who are dying are already compromised, and they are aged. We have some severe outbreaks in our long-term homes, seniors' homes, which is tragic, because it's opening up a whole range of issues about how those homes are being managed, how the people who are working, they are treated, and how they are actually paid, etc. All these other kind of periphery issues are coming to the fore, which are important, and I'm sure will shine an eye on our healthcare system and the areas that need to be improved and fixed. But say, yes, not as many ventilators are being used. The surge in hospitals that was expected in Canada has not occurred. And the majority of people who are dying already have complications. There's either heart disease, or there's already a pre-existing pneumonia, the fairly serious symptoms that this virus can, of course, add to. And probably finally, the age of the majority who have not been able to handle the virus are old. They're all over 75, 80 years of age.
So this virus is culling the weakest of us.
One might say that. That sounds very Malthusian. Malthus, the fellow who wanted to control the
Hey, I don't know what that
population.
means. I gotta watch it.
Malthus was a researcher back, and I can't remember what century he lived in, but he was the first proponent of population control.
Oh,
So the idea that the virus is a population control situation, yes, I'm sure there are conspiracy theorists who may have brought that up in terms of this being a virus that is going to, as you say, cull. But that's rather, as I say, Malthus-like, and certainly not at all leaning on the moral or altruistic side of what most, if not all of us are.
Well, I didn't mean it from that perspective. What I meant it from is the perspective that when animals live in the forest, the weakest are the ones that go,
Yeah,
and the stronger ones that continue. I'm
I totally agree with you. Absolutely.
not making and so anyway, that's my only point. And the weakest, when we have something that comes through like this, the weakest are, yes, very subject to that, very, very, very. And
Yeah,
um and so it's kind of, when I say natural, it is kind of natural. If you're at death's door, and this is a tough subject to even be touching on, the idea that there's something that's going to push that along as it kind of races through our species. And I'm not saying there's anything right about it, but it might in fact be natural, or it might be something that can't do much about it in some
yeah,
respects.
I totally agree. I just didn't want there to be that inference that there's something okay with it. But nature isn't fair, and sometimes we better say that nature is not fair. Sometimes things do happen to people, um, and this situation is putting a microscope under some aspects of the frailty of where human beings, where they are today, and whether the virus has been brought along because of our inattention, our lack of caring, or our lack of due diligence in the past, may in fact be that open, wonderful door that all these things come into play. We will care more. We will be a more due diligent. We will, in fact, realize that the frailty of human life is worth preserving to the point that we are more careful with what we bring out in the way of solutions, whether it's in healthcare or industrial or pharmaceutical, whatever. But I definitely see a silver lining in this particular situation we're in.
Well, I'm going to go risky when I say this, and that is that personal responsibility is a huge component of whatever it is you have in your life or don't have in your life. And I don't care if you're 93 years old or 24 years old, personal responsibility is a big component. And if you've lived your life relying on pharmaceuticals, relying on what the doctor tells you, instead of taking care of yourself, you might find yourself in a compromised position when you get older. And that also has to be looked at as a fact. And strength and weakness, it lies in our own laps. And while we may not have discovered this as a species yet, but our own personal power dictates how we go out when we go out. And I don't want to leave that out as an idea.
Yeah, no, you're good to mention it in the sense that it sort of goes back to the idea that we have the power within ourselves to actually bring about improvement and healing in our lives. This, of course, is predicated by a quality of life that includes, understandably, good nutrition, exercise, um, social relationships, these things that contribute to a person being able to balance their life as well as possible. And I do agree with you, Jim, that if these things are either neglected, ignored, or through some form of circumstance not able to be looked into, for instance, good nutrition may be more difficult to come by if one has a level, a living standard that is low, or where they are compelled to have a greater challenge with their livelihood, then yeah, one can see that it would be more difficult for a person of that in that situation to be able to um, arrive at that balance that we talk about. But for the most part, there are many of us who have the means. So it's a question now, well, are we actually taking advantage of the means we have as a community? Because if an individual, and I'll just say this before, even those of us who have the capability, then it is in our best interest, and actually in terms of our moral fiber, to take care of those who are weaker, who are in more dire straits and actually need a helping hand. So we, the individual who has the means and then is able to contribute to community, we end up having a wonderful situation where everybody is helped and everybody is able to thrive.
So you always bring an upbeat component to what we're talking about. It's quite true. As people become empowered and responsible for their lives, they naturally teach it. They naturally leave what? Trails of leadership behind themselves. They naturally do that. So it's not about I'm the fittest because I ate less plastic than you did in my lifetime and I'm going to live longer. I think if you eat more plastic, you're going to live longer. I'm not sure, but but the point is, anyway, but the point is, as we become empowered by our very nature, we empower others, and that's something that could be looked at and investigated. But as people discover yoga, they become influential with others. As people go within and discover the truth of their nature, they don't go out and as you become a better meditator, you don't go out and become a better bank robber. That isn't usually what happens. It's
No.
it's usually something a little different. More interest in the overall scheme of things and how to influence in a useful manner. Anybody that's into true empowerment, a spiritual empowerment with a spiritual component, is always going to have a regard for others. And this is the mistake that we're learning from, where we have these different kinds of plagues running on the planet, whether it's air pollution or the plastic in the middle of the oceans, or the Gulf of Mexico where Mississippi River dumps in. It's huge. The part of the Gulf of Mexico that has no oxygen. It's huge. It's like 800 miles across. Most of our states aren't that big, you know.
Yeah.
And all the fertilizers and all the not phytochemicals, all the different kinds of fertilizers and chemicals, they suck the oxygen out of the atmosphere, out of the water, and it's all dead fish. They're dead zones. And there's going to come a point where we're going to have to learn how to turn this around. And we're still going to get to your pharmacopoeia, but there's an article. I just shared it with it's in the Guardian. I'll put it at the bottom in the link. It's the title of the article is "It's Positively Alpine: Disbelief in Big Cities as Air Pollution Falls." There's several pictures of Delhi. I don't think I've sent this link to you.
No.
The article was 11th of April. It's an image of big cities, or a shot, and it has a divider, and you slide it this way, and it shows what the city, or let's say they take a picture of a landmark in the city, something big, like it could be the Eiffel Tower, or in this case, it's anyway, the point is there's before and after images, before the pandemic started and after, and the pollution in the air is dramatically different. Dramatic. Like nobody's business dramatic.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think we'll ever forget what we see during these pandemics. I don't think we'll ever forget it. And hopefully it'll help guide us.
I think that's the case. I think that stoppage has produced a lot of actually looking, that there's time to stop and look and consider. It'd be interesting to see for those who are deciding all of a sudden that they're going to maybe do something different with their regime while they're at home. In other words, maybe they will decide that, hey, I'm going to turn everything off and I just want to sit in quiet in the bedroom for a bit. Or, I want to try this yoga online class. Or I'm feeling a bit anxious, maybe a bit of meditation or listening to soft music, if that's even a good way to start, is going to make me calm down. And what I find intriguing is if one member of, let's say, a family has decided to embark on something new, on any of these things that I've just mentioned, what effect will they have not only on themselves, but what effect might they have on the rest of their family members?
That brings up Dr. David Hawkins. He was in here. He lived in Sedona. He died a couple of years ago. He was a PhD. He was a psychiatrist and an MD, and he had 700 psychiatrists under him in New York City in the 50s. In other words, he ran the administrative department of 2 different hospitals, psychiatric department, had 700 psychiatrists under him. He retired as an alcoholic, came out to Sedona, and when he discovered kinesiology, he wrote a series of books, the first one being Power versus Force. And the power of that, anyway, in that book was published the map of consciousness. And the map of consciousness is a scale of 0 to 1,000. And from 0 to under 200 are the states of apathy, fear, grief, anxiety, rage, whatever, up through pride. At 200 on the map is labeled courage. At 700 on the map is labeled the beginning of enlightenment. And so it takes courage to step out of apathy, fear, grief, anxiety, rage, pride, whatever. It takes courage to step up into neutrality, willingness, joy, peace, love, on to eventually get up toward enlightenment. But what's interesting, and by the way, this map also identifies the more resistant and the more rigid you are, the lower you are on the map. And so what's curious, the more resistant, more rigid you are, the less access you have to innate intelligence or source or the spiritual realms that most of us have so much interest in. And so as you move up the map, you partner with innate intelligence more. But what happens is one person at 700, admittedly a very high number, one person counterbalances a negativity of 70 million people below 200. One person at 600 counterbalances a negativity of 10 million people below 200. One person at 500 counterbalances a negativity of 750,000. One person at 400. And so you make a really good point. As we learn how to become quiet, we learn how to listen within, we start practicing things that quiet us down and introduce us to our inner nature, you might say, we start to become exponentially contributive. And I think it's a powerful idea to understand.
Yeah, I think that it's absolutely possible in this situation. In other words, we have every opportunity now to take advantage of silence and quiet and solitude and taking a walk on our own. I think that the effects of doing that, let's say you were going to go off for a walk by yourself, 2-meter distance, whatever the ramifications are, every day, which you've never done before, and you heard some birds singing, or you actually noticed the tree that was now blossoming, or you noticed that there was a child running down the sidewalk with a bike and laughing. It's amazing what those sounds in and of themselves, very simplistic, or those sights for that matter. But if you've never really paid attention or noticed them before, you will find that your system will actually open up. It will actually go, oh my gosh, why am I feeling this calm? Why am I feeling this sense of awakening? Well, this is all part of what Jim and I talk about, that process, right, Jim? where you finally get a bit of a look-see into what you are inside yourself.
Yeah, what I heard you describing is kind of like opening up like a flower. It's kind of like you're letting your subtle sensing become available. And as you let your subtle sensing become available, as you move out of rigidity and resistance and reaction and learn how to quiet down, and meditation's an optimum way to begin that process, you start sensing at a more subtle level. I was gonna ask, how many of us have sat and listened to crickets? You know, crickets, if the world didn't have crickets, the world would be dead. There's another word, cacophony,
Cacophony.
that or a symphony, if you will, that's
Yes.
produced by nature's sounds. And I remember during 9/11, the skies were silent, but there was no airplanes in the sky. I remember that lasted for 7 or 8 days, or however long it lasted, and the skies were absolutely silent, but it was a man-made noise that wasn't there. And I think if we go back to the forest once in a while, in fact, I love the idea of forest bathing. That's quite an expression. Alexis and I, every Sunday, we do a drive, and we do the same drive, and maybe it's the time of year, but right now we're not seeing elk at all. We haven't seen any really in 3 or 4 months. Maybe it's wintertime. But we used to see elk, and elk are big animals. They're as big as a
Mhm.
car. I mean, they're 1,000 pounds, all of them.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you see 6 or 8 of them, or you see them bounding across the road like they're almost like they're dancing. They're so delicate, but they're giant.
Mhm.
This is the forest,
Yeah.
and we all need to get back in touch with that a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, this has been a good little chat. So homework for the week or the day is get out to get into the forest.
So touch on the pharmacopoeia that is the human body. So would you suggest that as we quiet down and move into a more subtle world, our body will run on its own better, and it'll produce the chemicals and the nutrients and the different kinds of things it needs to keep the whole thing in stasis? Is that what you were kind of suggesting?
I'm not suggesting, it's a known scientific fact. If we take a look at Greg Braden, Bruce Lipton, Joe Dispenza, these are all thought leaders, scientists, researchers. Um, they're all not so much convinced, they've done the research, that we are capable of self-healing. We are capable of producing because we have the components within us, whether it's in our brain or it's in our heart, whether it's in our stomach. Those are probably the three key areas that would be important to hone into. Not the brain, because we've been examining the brain, and the brain's been taking a lot of credit for a lot of things, but it isn't necessarily in the brain's jurisdiction. I would,
Absolutely.
yeah, and both Jim, you and I know that the stomach and the heart, both key areas, both, especially the heart, has a brain of its own. That might be fairly dramatically said, but it's now been discovered that the brain does have a heart. So it would be very worthwhile to look into that, Google that, and find out a little bit more about what your body is all about. Because my gosh, it's a miracle. It's a walking miracle.
Let me give you an example of what you're talking about. So let's say that I burn my finger. Most people go, ah, and they get all caught up in the pain. And what do? They move into resistance. It shouldn't have happened. They fight the burn. And I've had the experience, and you got to catch it early, and you go to loving the burn, and it will disappear. I've had pretty good burns on the ends of my finger or something like that. And as quickly as you can, you have to have an understanding of that, but you move to loving the experience, And instead of the burn settling in and becoming grounded, you love it and it dissipates. And it's an easy thing to experience, but you have to have management of your mind to move to love instead of resisting the terror of it or the pain of it or you already know that you burned your finger, so you're out of luck and it's going to turn into a blister and it's going to, but you could move to allowing and have a very different experience. It's a great place to play, a great place to start.
Yeah.
No, no goop on your finger, no Band-Aids, no getting your mom to look at it.
That's right, especially if you're doing as a lot of baking going on these days, you know, catching that finger or the top of the hand in the oven, it might be just the solution.
Well, you know, it's funny when people hurt themselves. You know, we learned it when we were little kids. You fall down, your mom goes and picks you up. Oh, you do. And so, you know, you hurt yourself and there's a certain kind of attention that comes from it. So sometimes we make these things dramatic. If nothing else, we can tell stories about it around the water cooler the next day or something.
Yeah, but it is interesting that, you know, think of this as an old wives' tale. Well, you know, go to mommy and mommy will kiss it and make it better.
That's right.
And that is absolutely true.
So what you've done is you've absolved responsibility for it. You know, no, you let mom go fix it, and it does go away. I think that's actually a great deal of how prayer works. Is you turn it over to someone else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, or or you give the wound or the hurt some love, as you indicated, and love is a phenomenal. Oh my gosh, absolutely magnificent.
Seems to me the world's going to turn out just fine. That's my
I
guess.
think, yeah, I think so. I think we're going to be all right. Anyway, next week we'll see what we'll be up to. Any ideas for topics or?
Oh, topics. I think we should make it up as we go along. But I have a movie for you. It's really
Oh,
horrible. So on Netflix, you know, Alexis and I watch part of a movie every night. We might watch it in 3 stints, you know, 2-hour movie, maybe 40 minutes a time, a shot, whatever.
Yeah.
We watched a movie called The Core. And the world was coming. So this on Netflix, they've got all the world coming to the end movies on.
Apocalypse. Yeah.
That's right. And this one was called The Core. And they had to travel to the center of the earth to get the inner core to start spinning again.
Huh?
Anyway, it's really dumb. Hillary Swank, I don't recommend it, but we just finished that one, I think, last night.
And I know you're watching the second part of Frozen, was it? Or was it?
Oh, yeah, Alexis, yeah, she passed on that. I want to watch I want to see The Lion King. I've never seen any of that stuff. And I've seen just a tiny bit of these modern animation.
Yeah, no, the Frozen 2 was, well, did you see the whole thing?
No, but I'm gonna make Alexis watch it with me tonight.
It's absolutely beautiful. And the thing is the animation and the color and it's like being you're on a trip. Like it's visually and vocally, it's beautiful. It's very, very pretty.
I'll put a little something in her dinner tonight, and then we'll go down there and she'll be.
There you go. Yeah, yeah. No, no. You'll. I would see it again. I thoroughly enjoyed it. But anyway, I've got to get going.
All right.
So,
very good. We'll see what next week brings when it brings.
Yeah. Okay. Like I just said that just to throw something out, but I like it when we can just sort of go off the cuff.
So we're using Google Meet for the first time, and we've had a very good experience. We haven't had any problems. I sent you a chat link. Did you see it? It's the link to the article about the pollution in the big cities.
Yeah, and I've definitely, I mean, the dolphins in Venice.
Oh yeah?
They're swimming in the canals because they're so clear.
Is that right?
Yeah. Isn't that phenomenal?
So much potential if but we could learn. And
And I think we will, Jim. This is why we're here. We're born and we're on this planet now to be to be who we can be for others.
Let me take just 2 seconds. I know we want to go. There's a book by, I'll think of his name in a second, and it's called The Global Brain.
Yeah.
And do you know about it, of it?
I think I've heard the name, but I haven't read it.
He's in Glastonbury, I think. But what he talks about is how when a fetus is growing in the womb, first what happens is all of the neurons in the brain, they go and they all show up all over the whole, they form. And once all that settles down, then they go through another phase where they all connect to each other.
Mm-hmm.
That's where we are as a species. We now have all connection. We're all here. We've gone from the tribe mentality to the individual, and now we're going to go back to a tribe mentality at a much higher level. Where we're all going to connect, and the spiritual component will be not only the driver, but it's going to be the commonality that we all share. Because in fact, as humans, we are all alike. And this idea of borders and how different we are, and the Chinese are different from the this and that and
The
whatever.
separation, that whole survival of the fittest, all that kind of stuff, by the wayside. By the wayside.
So I imagine every once in a while the humans have an opportunity to wake up, and we're in one right now. And let's see what we do with it.
You bet.
I'll watch Frozen 2 tonight.
You gotta watch it so we can discuss it because it actually is great.
All right. Big hug to you.
Splendid. Hugs as well. Have a good week and a good night tonight. Bye-bye.